Okay, in this video, we're going to continue the upstairs and the downstairs, but we're doing it from a different model and a different perspective. So we mentioned in that last video, I talked about the upstairs brain being about 10%, that's your conscious, and the downstairs brain or your subconscious being about 90%. By looking at this, you can see that there's a dotted line that's surrounding the subconscious. That is your critical faculty. What does that mean? It's a veil. It's a veil between the upstairs and the downstairs brain. Now, you're familiar with the engineer type mind, right? You've met someone who's really in their head. They think that any kind of emotion is weakness. Everything should be done logically, reasonably, and rationally. And that's fine and good, except that it doesn't work. So what happens is they're not willing to go down into their subconscious. They want to keep everything at the cognitive level. And based upon the research that I've come across, we've been teaching this since the 1200s. So imagine we've got about 800 years of thought police telling us that anyone associated with emotions is somehow weak. But if you're reasonable and you're rational and you're logical, that's somehow good, that's strong. What we've missed for all these years is that we really want a balance. So in high school, I was taught that we only use about 10% of our brain. That didn't make any sense to me. Well, it makes sense now because of the advent of neuroscience. We understand that the only 10% that we ever had was just a cognitive approach to life. And that people who were emotional and were doing intuition, well, somehow that they're weak. Remember, you only hear women's intuition. You rarely hear someone go, well, it's just man's intuition. Well, we don't hear that because it's a perceived weakness in that person. So the critical faculty is a veil surrounding the subconscious, and it works this way. At birth, your subconscious, let me go back. In utero, your subconscious is empty. It's a blank slate. By birth, you've got 8 to 9 months worth of experiences that you actually remember at the subconscious level. Imagine for a second that you were taught your whole life that, let me just mark this here, that what we now know as a triangle is actually a square. From age 3 on, your mother and your father taught you that's a square. Then your grandma comes and visits you, and one day you're playing with your blocks and your toys, and grandma pulls this block of toy out, and she says, hey honey, what's that? And you go, oh, that's a square, grandma. And she goes, yes, dear, that's exactly right. I taught that to your mother, and your mother's now teaching that to you. That is a square. So you go to school, let's say you're in the 3rd grade, and you come across your geometry, and the teacher draws on the board this figure, and she says to the class, what is that? And everyone says, it's a square. Well, you know that's not true because you've been taught that that's a square and this is a triangle. Okay, now I'm going to backstep. Look at the dotted line again. At the subconscious level, you've been taught that the square and the triangle are different than everyone else has been taught. So when your teacher says, class, this is a triangle and this is a square, you reject it. No, that's not what my parents taught me. So you go home and you go, Mom, they said that that's a square, not a triangle. That's the critical faculty. Imagine your whole life going through believing that you don't have worth because you were adopted, or that it's your fault because your parents got divorced. We're going to cover that a little bit in this video, but we'll cover it in greater detail in the 8 False Narratives video. So the point of it being is that your conscious and your subconscious both have specific roles. They're to be integrated, which we talked about. And there's a veil separating the two called the critical faculty. The other reason this is so critical is because we engage a lot in outside-in motivation in our world today. Motivational speakers are ubiquitous. Posters on the walls in your home and at your office telling you you can do it, you're the greatest. The reason that positive affirmations have very little efficacy is because they can't get past the critical faculty. If you're reading a poster on the wall that says, you're the best, you will always do your best, it gets at the critical faculty, it rejects it. because it knows that's not true at the subconscious level, because your false narrative is saying something different. So let's continue what the roles are. At the conscious level, it's rational and it's analytical. It's your temporary memory. It's values and it's willpower. Those are the four bigs. All right. Now go into the subconscious. Infinite power. Every major athlete nowadays knows that their subconscious, now watch where I'm going. The idea is to learn to focus subconscious so you can lose focus. If I'm a tennis player and I'm having the game of my life, man, I've got my forehands working, my backhands working, and my partner comes up and says, Himmer, why are you doing so good today? If I try to explain it, because I want to think about it now, that's a guaranteed way I'm going to lose that match now. Because I'm thinking about it at the cognitive level. What made me so good is I didn't have to think about it at the subconscious level. The neural pathway was so deep, it was a habit, it was ingrained. I had muscle memory in everything I'm doing. Imagine having that type of muscle memory, that type of ingrained neural pathway in your interpersonal relationships. So it's your infinite power. It's how you're going to heal. It's how you're going to grow. But it doesn't judge. Have you ever met someone who's an alcoholic and says, I promise I'll never drink again? But as soon as the chips got down, they were in so much pain, they medicated again. Someone who knows they shouldn't criticize their children, who knows they shouldn't nag their spouse, they shouldn't look at pornography, they shouldn't fill in the blanks, but they end up doing it over and over and over again, despite their best wishes, their best intent, their willpower and their values, because 10% doesn't hold a candle to 90. So you can't judge mean that you're not going to judge how you're going to medicate. Remember, we're hardwired to connect. When we don't connect, it hurts. When it hurts, we medicate. The next one, imagination. It's where the power of thinking through things happens. When I want to heal, if I want to get better at something, if I'm going to give a presentation, if I'm going to engage in a golf tournament, a baseball tournament, a musical recital, how many of you practice in your mind before? You imagine what's going on. We now know that's very effective. According to some researchers, it's a 6-to-1 ratio. Meaning if I can imagine it happening, okay, I'm going to picture hitting that golf ball on my drive. I'm going to have this nice little baby draw. It's going to go 300 yards. It's my imagination. Okay. It's like practicing it 6 times. In real life, my imagination has such an effect. You see, the brain can't tell the difference between what you imagine and what you actually experience. Next, it's your permanent memory. Everything that's happened to you from conception on, which means if you had a rough go in utero, mom and dad were arguing, maybe dad wanted you to be aborted, maybe they just had fights, or maybe there was tremendous stress going on in the world around you. You will feel that through the umbilical cord from your mother, and you will carry all the drugs that she had if you have an overabundance of stress like cortisol, testosterone, norepinephrine. That you feel. So there's your permanent memory, you know everything. Next, it's your emotions, which is what everyone has said is so weak. Yes, if out of control, if you're hijacked, emotions are not healthy because your downstairs brain is running the upstairs brain. And then ultimately, it's your protective. Now notice what came up on the screen just now. True self versus false self. Your true self is your authentic self, which we'll get into more detail later. Your false self is your saboteur. It's the shadow that you have. So it's the idea that you're telling yourself a false narrative. So a quick analogy real quick. If you have seen the movie How to Train Your Dragon, Hiccup, the protagonist, he's the young boy, remember, he's Stoic's boy, and he's thin like a rail, and everyone else is big and beefy. He used to be the next chief. He's the brains of the story. The dragon, or Toothless, is the muscle. When you watch that movie, if you just think about it, remember, the dragon lost a tail, and so Hiccup created a prosthetic tail. Together, they could fly. Together, they could fight evil. But boy, when they got separated, they just flailed through the air. That's exactly the same thing. In the older days, we called it elephant and the rider, but more modern one, it's hiccup and toothless. Upstairs, downstairs, 10%, 90%. So in conclusion, one more thing I wanted to share with you. Remember I mentioned the false self and the false narratives? Here are the false narratives. So as you look at this list, just kind of review it and ask yourself, am I telling myself any of those false narratives at the subconscious level? And we'll go into more detail how to find out. But imagine the following. Here's the rules. Your experiences that you've had from in utero on lead to a set of beliefs, your identity about yourself. Those beliefs, that identity, dictates your behavior. You do not change behavior by talking about behavior. You can do cognitive therapy all day long, but until you get down to changing the beliefs and then the experiences in reverse order, you cannot change behavior. At least I've not seen it done. I have no worth. How does someone act if they don't believe they have worth? It's my fault. My parents got divorced because of me. I'm not lovable. See, my dad left me. He didn't even want me to be alive. He wanted me aborted. I can't have emotional intimacy with people, mutual trust and respect. I've literally seen couples right in front of me sabotage their marriage because they didn't believe they were worthy of having emotional intimacy. I don't deserve to be happy. I don't deserve to have money. I've seen entrepreneurs sabotage their business because they didn't believe they deserved to be successful. I can never be safe. Now that's carrying 3 levels. It's spiritual, emotional, and physical, depending on the experiences that this person had when they were younger. And this is a big one. I'm powerless, helpless, and hopeless. You can actually measure that or notice that behavior by recognizing the drama triangle, which will also be covered. That's the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. And then lastly, I'm not good enough. Any one of those false narratives will dictate harmful behavior, maladaptive behavior, collusionary behavior. So this entire process here is just to give you an education on upstairs and downstairs, the relationship between the two, the importance of learning how to bypass the critical faculty. And that critical faculty, just by way of information, so you can see it's up there now, the critical faculty is what you will be bypassing when you start practicing mindfulness, when you understand how important it is to be meditative and contemplative, to slow life down, to be narrowly focused, to balance your systems. All of that is within the upstairs and the downstairs. Thanks for listening. We look forward to talking to you in the next one.